brain theory, and I'm talking about BRANE theory of bouncing membranes and multiple universes and parallel realities, that is not God. Now, you might make the argument that that just opens up another realm, that we have to find out where the brains came from, and then God might be there, but that's definitely a rabbit hole that I don't want to go down.
Is that when we look at quantum fluctuations, we may well be looking at God himself, or at least the direct actions of God. If you imagine quantum fluctuations in their totality, not just a quantum fluctuation or even a patch of quantum fluctuations in a given physical space, but if we stop to consider quantum fluctuations in their totality, that is an incredibly huge and powerful, energetic, and constantly changing system, and yet also a consistent system that doesn't change. Very interesting, actually, and I think that it does, in many ways, mirror the idea of a gigantic consciousness.
Michael, have you been listening to Deepak Chopra? Did you know that you just stepped into the rabbit hole of Chopra's quantum mysticism? Are you familiar with Jupiter's Great Red Spot? It is also a huge, powerful, energetic system that hasn't changed its basic shape for over 300 years. It may not compare to quantum fluctuations throughout the universe, but it is thousands of times larger, more energetic, and more powerful than your brain. It is not the power and size of a system that make it conscious. It is the organizational and functional elements that make your consciousness. At least, that is the paradigm in modern neuroscience.
You know, the more, and I'm not saying the brain isn't accurate. It's entirely possible, although also it's every bit as speculative as my quantum God idea.
Excuse me? Did you just equate your quantum God idea with M theory? Okay, your idea is speculative, and M theory has speculative elements. But the fact that you can use that same word to describe both ideas does not make them equally valid. M theory is rooted in a mathematical description of the behavior of subatomic particles, a description that came out of testing and experimentation on other failed ideas. The guys who are working on that theory are still using the scientific process. Michael is not. Michael's little ad hoc hypothesis about quantum foam being conscious is not rooted in any descriptive equations of either quantum phenomena or of consciousness. The only connection between those two phenomena seems to be that both are kind of weird and mysterious. Mike's idea is so far a mathless theory. There is no math. That means there is no real model of anything here. It is not trying to explain the results of any experimental data. He is just trying to fit God into a gap and give the idea some coherence. His only data is biblical data. And that is not necessarily a description of real events. It may be similar to concocting theories of how vampires could be real. Worst case scenario for Mike, he's going to become to quantum theory what Nephilim free is to geology. In the worst case scenario for M theory, it could only fail as badly as Ptolemy's epicycles. But remember, Ptolemy's epicycles were a useful approximate framework that described the motions of the planets as seen from Earth, even though it was based on a false model, an Earth-centered universe. So while the general framework used to create epicycles was discredited, the theory was still a useful tool for knowing where Mars and Venus would be on any particular night. As a general framework, the false model of epicycles was still valuable to astronomers as a calculating tool. And M theory is still useful for thinking about how nuclear forces work. Mike's ideas don't really help me think about how God, quantum phenomena, or consciousness work, nor do they allow me to predict anything about them. M theory is pretty much the only game in town, like epicycles before Copernicus. But Mike's ideas are not the only game in town. As I've already said, Mike is trying to naturalize the supernatural. Most theists don't try to naturalize God. They think God is supernatural, spiritual, unknowable, and ultimately unexplainable. Same with consciousness. It would not need evolution or design or parts operating over time. God and our consciousness would not be composed or divisible by any physical means. Nothing that needs to be organized by evolutionary forces in a way that achieves thought. That vision of consciousness contradicts our neuroscientific paradigm. Thus, the theists' war on neuroscience because of this very successful paradigm. Skierkowa has assumed this evolutionary paradigm about intelligence and consciousness, which is very much in line with my War on Neuroscience series, which is why I've taken an interest in this debate. I don't know what Mike thinks he sees of consciousness in quantum fluctuations, but I find it as vague, undefined, and as annoyingly vacuous as any other theist's views on God and consciousness. The vacuousness may help Mike avoid an old argument that you'll find in Dawkins' The God Delusion, the argument that states that positing a God to explain the universe backfires because an intelligence that could design and create a universe would necessarily be far more complex than what cosmologists are actually looking for, an equation that can be put on a t-shirt. Of course, even without that equation, we can see that using a supernatural God to explain how the universe got here is really an anti-explanation. An anti-explanation that explains nothing and denies the possibility and power of such explanations. The equation you can put on a t-shirt would indeed be good evidence against a complex God. That God would be what Hawking claimed in his latest book, The Grand Design, unnecessary. It would also be evidence against a supernatural God, but the problem will be explaining why that is so. There are foundational issues to our view of the universe that theists do not seem to understand. In fact, one of those issues, though not the most important one, will become clear if you watch Mike's 3-part interview with Together for Peace. Here are some audio clips and my comments.
There was one case where someone presented, I think it was a variant of the cosmological argument or something, and D.P.R. Jones's response was simply that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Right.
The first problem here is that D.P.R. Jones never made such a statement. I PM'd D.P.R. and asked. He denied making such a video. This indicates that your memory is not serving you well, Michael, and that you are not listening carefully to atheist arguments, but are inadvertently strawmanning them. I know of no one who has used the extraordinary claims argument against the cosmological argument. The closest I've ever seen to that was Michael Payton's Column and Causation video. It's linked in the underbar. But he never ever mentions extraordinary claims. That would require outlining why one of the premises is, in fact, not an obvious or logical fact, but rather an extraordinary claim. He only approaches that point. But I'll have to get to that later, because you soon make another error that indicates why you could not understand that.
Right. And it's like, wait. First of all, extraordinary is a subjective term.
Not all uses of the term extraordinary are subjective. Only 2 criteria for determining an extraordinary claim have a subjective component, but the other 2 are as objective and fact-driven as anything in science. Here are the 4 criteria I have identified, but this list is tentative. I may add more criteria later or regroup them. The first criteria is personal experience. That is subjective, no question. The second criteria, scientific data and the paradigms they fit in. That is not subjective. Scientific paradigms are not subjective, and if any claim contradicts a current scientific paradigm, that claim is an extraordinary claim. A history of bogosity would be another criteria. Historical facts are not subjective, but no one knows all the history. That's too big a subject. The example here would be UFO claims. No matter how credible an abduction story might sound, there is a long history of delusion and fakery in such claims, and that makes all the claims improbable and therefore extraordinary. Another criteria is the stakes involved. This is also subjective because we value different things, but the higher the stakes, the more extraordinary a claim is going to be.
That's not a scientific claim. You can't say, well, this is extraordinary.
As I just pointed out, you are wrong again. Extraordinary claims that contradict scientific paradigms are scientific in nature. Plate tectonics would be a good example of such an extraordinary claim. Back in 1912, Alfred Wegener made an extraordinary claim. He noticed that all of the continents seemed to fit together like the pieces of a giant puzzle. He thought maybe they were once all joined together in a huge landmass that broke up and drifted apart. He called the supercontinent Pangea. The scientific community called it continental drift theory and rejected it. Wegener could not find extraordinary evidence to support his extraordinary claim, and so other scientists considered him a crackpot. They were all convinced the Earth was rock solid and immovable because that was their paradigm. Why that was their paradigm? Well, you just have to pick up a rock and feel its weight and hardness to understand part of it. Rock is just not fluid stuff. Eventually, however, two pieces of killer evidence came to light. First, while exploring the ocean floor, the mid-Atlantic ridge was discovered. That's the place where molten magma rises up to create new crust and spread the seafloor. And second, a new seismic map of the world showed that volcanic and earthquake activity were concentrated along areas where the plates met. This also explained how mountain ranges were formed, by continents crashing into each other and rumpling up rock. And so the theory of plate tectonics was confirmed and the scientific paradigm changed. That was a good example of extraordinary, paradigm-changing evidence. There was a heavier molten mantle beneath the Earth's crust, and thus a reasonable mechanism to explain how the drift happened. Thermal convection currents move the crustal plates. So, when considering an extraordinary claim, think about the scientific paradigms you might be contradicting. And when considering extraordinary evidence, think about seismic maps and mid-Atlantic ridges. Think of mechanisms and explanations.
It's like, well, what is the difference between an ordinary claim about God and an extraordinary claim about God?
How about an example? I think this is an extraordinary claim about God.
I want to talk to you just for a few moments today about raising the dead. It's a reality that's happening all over the world today in increasing momentum and numbers. Many people are being raised from the dead all over the United States and the third world countries all around the world. It's a very exciting day to be living in. Do you know that Jesus actually commanded us to raise the dead? Isn't that something?
What do you think?